I was happy to see them.
Right on.
Yeah.
Well, it sounded like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it
I
was.
stepped in and into a few spots and heard and everything.
Yeah.
And just the laughter and the cohesion.
Yeah.
So rock and roll. Okay. So Pat, why did you contribute to the formation of SWW?
Well, I got involved or was involved in the formation of SWW basically from its inception. I worked for the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour at that time, and I'd started working there in 1976. And so I was pretty involved with regard to setting up the initial meetings, the initial women's conferences that were held. And I was very familiar with all of the women that were active in getting involved at that time. So I was on the spot. I was at the Federation of Labour as their executive assistant, and so I was quite familiar with a lot of the issues. And in fact, I'd done a lot of the research leading into an examination of Federation policy and its shortfalls with regard to women's issues and concerns that were being expressed by working women. So that's pretty much why I got involved. I was also a keen supporter of trying to improve the status of women within unions and get them more active. It was really a terrible male-dominated situation. So we were just starting. We were just starting to get involved as women, and so it was quite an exciting time.
Right on, right on. Just as a
say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Try not to look over at me.
Oh, did I do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not here. I'm not going to make eye contact
Okay.
with you ever.
Yeah.
So try not
I'm
to
sorry. I
look-
didn't
It's
even
okay.
notice. You know, I have a
It's not-
tendency.
You're trying to include me, I think.
I think I
I
always
don't
just.
wanna
No,
yeah, it's
I
a
just.
very common. I think it's a very common female kind of response. Is,
Yep.
What kinds of women joined the SWW, Pat?
Well, it was quite an interesting group. Initially, it was trade union women because they came together around specific issues, and of course, there was a natural kind of gathering of trade union women. But there were other women as well, and I think they were women that were interested in seeing things improve for themselves. Some of them were not unionized, although there weren't a lot of unorganized women. Like, there might be women that were active at a different level rather than in a union. They may not be unionized, but they would be women that would be working in third world support agencies. They'd be working in, a different kind of capacity, but where they would be aware of women's issues and keenly interested in them. So we never really attracted just your ordinary, I don't like to say it that way, but we never really attracted just your ordinary person on the street. You know what I mean? You would have had some basic interest in women's issues and the circumstances of women within organizations or within the workforce or something. So it wasn't it was always a group that seemed to be pretty sort of turned, I don't know what the proper word is. The group always seemed to be people who were very informed, I guess you could say, to some extent, and certainly had opinions on things. So,
Was it a diverse group of women? Was it across all classes? Was it across all race, or what kind of women?
well, the women that did come together finally in SWW were definitely from different classes, I guess you could say. There would definitely be some people who came from very well-off backgrounds, and then a lot of people who didn't. Now, I don't like to name names because that's kind of a little unfair, but, one of our primary activists, her father was a significant judge, for example, in the province. There would be other people who came from that kind of a background that gave them sort of, a better economic start. And then there were a lot of just ordinary working women, like myself. I mean, my dad ran a service station. I mean, that was what my background was. And he was very keen on ensuring that all of us, there were 4 daughters in our family, went to university, and 3 of us did. And so we were able to sort of get some education that was, we moved beyond what my parents had been. Like, my dad had grade 8 education, my mom had grade 11. Lovely with people, but so there were people like me. I mean, so I wasn't by myself in that circumstance. So there were people from different kind of economic backgrounds, people who worked even in retail stuff, you know, or had to work in different kinds of jobs that were very low paying, and some people who were artists, farm women, you know, who were active in terms of supporting a family farm. You know, so there was, was quite a diverse group of people. And some people who came with, their parents had been active, you know, had been academics and that type of thing. You know, like Christine, for example. Christine Smiley. You can cut that out, I suppose. Sorry about that. But you know what I mean? Like, it was a diverse group. But there weren't a lot of people who were dirt poor, although some people were very poorly off, but, you know, they weren't necessarily right at the very bottom of society with regard to wages and so on and so forth. So.
Okay, how did SWW fit into the political context of the labor movement at the time?
Well, that was, we were really quite a shock for the labor movement. The labor movement didn't really welcome SWW with open arms at all. We started by rejecting the kind of parameters that the labor movement placed on women with respect to who could get involved in these issues. So, you know, the women's conferences that were held by the Federation of Labor back in 76 or 77, which they had been mandated to do by the SFL convention itself, gave us a forum initially as a group of women, but they said, no, you can't have women who aren't part of what they call Congress-affiliated unions involved in this, because they weren't prepared to finance that. So you couldn't have unorganized women, you couldn't have teachers, you couldn't have nurses, because none of them at the time were in a Congress-based union. Even RWDSU, Retail Wholesale Department Store Union, which is a very activist union at that time, they couldn't get involved because they'd split from their international, and they were sort of on the outs, if you will, with the labor movement. So even though they were a union, they weren't affiliated to the Canadian Labour Congress. So it was very restrictive. So the second conference, I recall that very well. They sent in the heavies, you know, like from Ottawa to monitor this conference, and it was to make sure, I guess, that we were going to sort of toe the so-called party line. And I'll never forget, one of the women that was involved in coming in was a woman by the name of, she's retired now, so I can, and we subsequently, I've gotten to know her a little better, but Lorraine Singler, her name was, and she was the person that was coordinating the Congress's Bank Workers Organizing Committee, and they were totally opposed to SORWAC, for example, the Service Office and Retail Workers Union of Canada, which was a feminist union originating out of Vancouver and was very actively involved in organizing bank workers. So there was kind of a competition there. And so they sent these women into that conference, and then they were horrified because we passed motions and so on that said we shouldn't be closely affiliated with the NDP because that was restrictive, you know, with regard to us being able to challenge government policies and so on and so forth, because you'd have to be playing a different kind of role. Besides that, the NDP at the time was the government, but they were also the employer for a huge number of union members, and they weren't always, let's put it this way, they weren't always very good with their employees. I mean, there was a huge strike in '79 by SGEA at the time, and before I started working for them, for the 5-4, the 5-4 work week, work 5 days, and then get a weekend, and then work 4 days and get 3 days off, you know, and they had to strike for that, and it was an important issue for women because a lot of them were child-rearing age, and they had youngsters at home and so on, and so the strike was very important for working women, and and the employer in that circumstance was the NDP. So you wanted to be able to retain arm's length, so you could be critical without, you don't want to leap in bed with these guys. It wasn't very good. Anyways, so Was the labor movement happy with SWW? Absolutely not. And of course, we then subsequently played a role of supporting women's caucuses in unions, providing them with the policy backup, because we did all these position papers and policy on tech change and child care and equal pay, huge number of issues that we undertook. And we provided that to the women who were active in the union to take forward and challenge their own unions, with developing policy and putting those items on the bargaining table. So, no, the labor movement, they're a funny group. I mean, I worked for them for 20 years in a full-time capacity, and they get nervous about people who challenge them, especially when it's a group of women. And certainly since the trade union movement has traditionally, and unfortunately still is, dominated by men. So, they were very leery. Communist uprising, usurpers or something. I don't know what they thought of us, but it wasn't always very pleasant for them.
Right on. Well answered. Let's see. The next question is about SWW decision working with coalitions. So would you tell us about that decision to work with coalitions and with other women's and left organizations?
Yeah, SWW was very keen on getting involved in coalitions with other women's organizations, and certainly working in coalitions with other community-based groups. Now, we never formed a coalition with the unions. We had members who were in unions who would actively pursue policy issues and get elected as delegates to conventions and be able to speak on the kinds of policy issues that we put forward. We never would have been able to form a coalition with them. It just really, we weren't at that level. But we did, we were able to form coalitions with other women's organizations around specific kinds of issues. For example, we worked with the Take Back the Night coalition. There was a group of, that was more or less a coalition of women's organizations that came together around a specific issue of demanding safety for women and children, at night. And I'm sure you're familiar with the premise of what the Take Back the Night group was all about. So we would work, that wasn't our issue per se, but we would definitely be supportive of that. And so we would come together in a coalition around that issue, and we would be able to support it because it was certainly part of our policy. It was part of the whole question about violence against women. And that was a pretty important issue for a lot of us in the Saskatchewan working women. It wasn't just violence in the home, it was violence in the workplace, it's violence in the streets. I mean, women have had it pretty rough, in all fairness, in terms of being on the receiving end of a lot of violence. So we also worked with other women's organizations around International Women's Day. Again, that's not ours. It wasn't ours. We didn't own International Women's Day, but we were very keen to be involved with other organizations around things like International Women's Day to make it a more powerful expression. So, there was Status of Women group. At the time was the Saskatchewan Action Committee, the Status of Women. It was there. A completely different group of women that were sort of in leadership positions within the group. Palma Anderson, who's now dead, was a school teacher who was the head of the Saskatchewan Action Committee at the time, and really a very nice woman, very interested in taking SAC forward, if you will, on those kinds of issues. So yeah, we would work with SAC, and we would work with, there was, I was just trying to think of some of the other women's organizations that were around. A lot of the organizations would be maybe more single issue. There were groups that were, women's groups that were formed around the specific issue of abortion and the right to have a safe and legal abortion. And of course, that was the pro-choice, if you will, a group, and they were specific on that. So, we would form our coalitions with that. Not that we were necessarily the people who initiated it. Sometimes we did. Sometimes someone else did. but we learned how to work in coalitions, I think, in a good way, because we never tried to take it over. You know, it was a very important thing that you support an issue, other people support an issue. They don't have to be part of us in order to support that issue with the same degree of interest and fervor. And it's a really valuable lesson, because, for example, on the question of abortion rights, people wanted to put a lot of time and effort into that, whereas women in SWW put a lot of time and effort into issues that were more centered on the workplace, if you will, or, you know, that type of thing. So we had tech change. We would be interested in health and safety in the workplace. We would be interested in equal pay issues, so on and so forth, and getting people elected. Whereas the people who were active in the abortion rights area were very keenly involved in challenging a lot of specific things about access to abortion and the right to a safe and legal abortion. And we could support that. We would work in a coalition with those people around specific issues and actions that came up from time to time. So yeah, coalitions, it's very important, it seems to me, to have access to a variety of groups that support single issues, and then they strengthen themselves by coming together in coalitions and working in that kind of a way.
Good, thank you. Well answered. Let's see. What was the most important strategy used by the SWW that contributed to its effectiveness as a women's organization?
I think some of the most effective strategies we used that really made us effective in the broader community were the issues around strike support. We were very keenly aware of the importance of supporting unions who were involved in advancing women's issues. For example, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers had made the issue of paid maternity leave a strike issue, and that was so significant from my point of view. There's still, at this very point in time, there are very few unions that have won that right for women in their work areas to have paid maternity leave. So, you know, you can take maternity leave now through UI, for example, and you'd get, or EI, I guess it's employment insurance. You can get EI and take maternity leave for a certain period of time. The number of weeks are defined legislatively and so on and so forth, prior to your, quote, confinement and after your confinement. But the vast majority of women take time off to bear children unpaid. And so even in a unionized work setting. So struggles around an issue like paid maternity leave, I think, are extremely important, and still are. You know, they still are very important, and they're gradually making breakthroughs on that in a number of different areas. So strike support around unions who had the courage and the initiative to really stand behind issues that were extremely important for women were really worthy of support. So we would organize strike support, which meant going to picket lines and holding benefits dances so you could raise the morale of people who are on the line, that type of thing, and assisting in any way we could, if it was in matter of doing publicity around the strike or taking on tasks that they didn't have either the members for because it was a small group or whatever. We would take that on. So strike support was important, I think, for us. So that was one area that SWW gained a reputation in the broader labor movement and in the women's movement around, and we were very successful at it. We were good at doing that. We could write, and we could help them put up pamphlets, and we could, you know, that type of thing. So I think our strike support was pretty important. Our coalition work was good as well. But we were also extremely good at writing policy. I mean, I don't know whether you've seen our policy manual that we had. We did more writing of policy and we educated our own members to assist in providing education to others on specific issues like tech change and so on. Like I was, that was my key area. I was a tech change person, if you will. In SWW, a lot of the writing that was done, I did. And I did that in SGEU as well, because I was a staff person at that point in time in my life. And so in addition to handling grievances and doing arbitrations and so on in the union. I also did their educational work around technological change. So to try, and that of course is a very key issue for women. And it's now just having its main impact. It's taken 15 years for it really to hit hard. So it's not just automated tellers. It's the technology has now finally really decimated a lot of workplaces and caused workload problems on the remaining staff, many of whom are women. So yeah, we had those kinds of skills. I think that we were successful in terms of gaining a good reputation, if you will, that we were solid in our research, solid in our support of actions. We were good organizers around the question of strike support. And so we did, I think, have a reasonably good reputation in the broader women's movement. And who knows, might have been elsewhere too.
Well said, well said. Take a little bit of a turn here. Why, Pat, did SWW fold?
Well, you know, why did SWW fold? It didn't really fold. It kind of just gradually disappeared. I think mainly what happened was we were actually quite successful in terms of getting women involved in paid staff positions, for example, in unions. I know a lot of us ended up, like I had started off working as the executive assistant for the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour. It means I wrote their briefs and I did all that type of thing. But I subsequently moved over to SGEU as a staff representative and got involved there. That's incredibly demanding work. And so a lot of women who became active in their unions found that their union work started to take over a significant part of their lives. And I only use that as one example because not everybody ended up as a highfalutin union person, but a lot of people ended up by being, well, you know, if you were a lawyer, like Gwen Gray, my good friend, she's a lawyer. She ended up as working in not ended up, but I mean, after she finished her articles and so on, she becomes a lawyer. Well, that's incredibly demanding work as well. You work evenings, you work weekends. Then she became a mom, and then she subsequently went through private practice, became the chairperson of the Labor Relations Board. You know, you have people who just, their jobs became much more demanding. We all grew older, and our jobs began to sort of take on more depth, and many of us were actually quite successful, you know, in terms of what we did. I could just name all those women out there. Christine Smiley, I mean, what is she? She's the executive director of the Canadian Diabetes Association. She plays an incredibly significant and important role. In our younger days, we were more involved from the point of view of our work was a way of supporting our activity. And I think it got turned around that our activity, that, you know, that we, our work then became so important that it ended up by taking over our ability to have a lot of extra time. And that just comes, I think, with age and with becoming more involved in your work environment, regardless of what that work environment is. We all were working, and many people had children as well, so they ended up by having more demands on their time. So I think it just kind of slipped away, you know what I mean? It didn't just sort of, there was no big catastrophic sort of thing that said end of SWW. I think we're still likely registered somewhere as a society in Saskatchewan, but people just didn't have the time to put into the work at SWW undertook to the same extent. So it just faded away.
SWW trained you all so well.
I think SWW trained us all too well, so that we ended up by being very successful in terms of what we did, and it took us away from the organization. We couldn't maintain it any longer.
So then what would you say is SWW's legacy, Pat?
SWW's legacy? Well, I think its legacy is really one of trying to knit together really basic concepts of socialism and the egalitarian nature of what socialism is all about, with feminism, what it's like to be a woman in a workplace, in a family setting, in society as a whole. We really, I think, struggled with those issues and tried to integrate them somewhat so that your politics weren't something that was separate from how you lived and how you thought and how you responded. And your feminism was a crucial element of that. It's interesting listening to one of the women yesterday talking about how she called herself a socialist feminist, and the noun was feminism, she said, and I really appreciated that. I likely would have called myself a feminist socialist. I would have seen myself as a socialist because I was working to see that kind of change occur within the economic structures of society, and my feminism was my ability to sort of, I guess you could say, give me the courage and with my sisters to undertake those kinds of battles. Feminism was what gave me my strength. It was a really important aspect to my politics. You know what I mean? I shouldn't use that expression, you know what I mean. I don't like that at all. But it was a very important aspect. And I think there's a legacy there that SWW has left with women, that we were able to pull those issues together, and we left a good policy residue as well. So we had a legacy of activism. We had a legacy of being progressive, i.e. beyond the standard sort of political definitions. We left a legacy of challenge, of wanting to challenge authority and challenge things that were wrong in an upfront kind of a way, and a legacy of being supportive of women, and hopefully giving our sisters the ability to do the same thing, because that's what makes you whole. That's what really gives you, it's what gives you your sort of definition, your self-respect. And that's very important. You can't be an effective, active person if you don't respect yourself in the first place. And SWW was good at helping us do that.
Right on, well said. If you, Pat, were to speak to a younger woman today about your experiences in SWW, as a way of encouragement, what would you say to her?
Well, younger women, what would I say to younger women today to sort of see where they were at? I think I would ask them to examine the organizations they were active in and see what the position of women is in those organizations. And I reflect a wee bit on the fact that we had a pamphlet at one point in time that we put out about choosing a union, I think it was called. And we ask women to look at, if you're choosing a union, what do you look at? Well, you look at the union's constitution and see how democratic it is. How do they elect their leaders? Those types of issues. I mean, look at how that union is structured to allow for people to be involved. So I would say to young women today, if you're active, because a lot of them are very active, is your organization democratic? Does it allow for everybody to have an equal voice? Are women treated equally within that framework? I mean, and not just in a patronizing kind of token way, but is there genuine equality? I remark back as well to a comment that another one of the speakers at the SWW meeting made about her husband, and saying that he didn't take on child rearing and home responsibilities in a way that he was helping her. He took them on because it was his responsibility, and he just did those things, And I really sort of thought that was useful. So you don't need to have tokenism if you're a woman, but you have to look at it. So I would tell women to look at that, to examine what they're involved, and then struggle. How to learn how to struggle. And doing that is important, how to have a voice. And if you need to have support, then how do you form a caucus or a group of people that can provide that level of support that you need in order to function in that particular organization? So I think those are the kinds of things I would try and talk about.
Good, thank you. What would you say, Pat, were the personal changes that happened for you as a result of your involvement with SWW?
My involvement with SWW really was what gave me the courage to stand up and start to challenge things. I had been, up until that point in time, a relatively active person, and I had been hired by the Federation of Labor to take on their executive assistant role, which, and I hadn't been really a long-time activist in the union, and so I still had a lot of hesitations about speaking out or challenging things and so on and so forth. And SWW, I think, gave me that courage. They gave me the skills, and they gave me the backup in terms of policy. They gave me a forum for me to be able to sort of develop skills to take forward, a challenge in the right way, and they gave me a whole community of women. Like, I mean, look at that group that was here the other day. I mean, they just gave you this wonderful, wonderful connections with all these women who shared some of the ideas and a place to struggle with those issues. It was really quite a marvelous group, and they still are.
What would you say, what lessons have you learned through your experience with SWW or during that time?
What lessons did I learn?
Organizational lessons.
Or is that you're talking more organizational?
More about the organization.
Okay, more about the, I guess looking back on SWW in that time, what lessons as an organization did you learn?
Well, as organizational lessons are, I don't want to repeat myself.
Just say a couple.
I guess the organizational lessons that we may have learned, that I would have learned, were how to work with other people, how to sort of how to learn how to compromise. I know that sounds funny, but it's not the compromise with, say, the employer or a compromise with the people in authority, but how do you form consensus, I guess perhaps is a better word, with a group of people. So that means you have to be able to moderate your own point of view. You have to learn how to scale back, I believe it's this way, or it's my way, or the highway sort of idea. You have to learn how to moderate that, and so that you can reach a consensus so that you can effectively function. That's something I learned, I think, in SWW. I learned it working in coalitions that SWW was involved with, and it's a lesson that's served me very well in my working life. It's part of the whole negotiating process that you have to have as a union representative. It's the art of being able to compromise. In other words, the strike isn't the end thing. It only results if there's no ability at all to do anything else, if you're driven into a corner. So how to do things on consensus, how to accommodate people. The SWW provided me with, I think, the way my ability to be able to do that in a more effective way. So I think that's basically about it.
Let's hindsight's always 20/20. But what do you think SWW could have done differently?
Oh dear, what could SWW have done differently? I know this sounds really quite pompous. I don't know whether there's really anything I would have changed about the organization. It would have been nice, I suppose, if we'd been able to reach a broader group. And I'm sure that if we'd done a lot of soul searching along the way, we would have been able to be quite critical of some of the things that we did. And did we handle this issue properly? Did we handle that circumstance in a way that wasn't offensive or that, put us forward? But broadly speaking, I don't think that there was a lot I would have changed about it. And like I say, I don't think that I mean that in a pompous way, but I think that by and large, for a group of women who were defining themselves as both feminist and as socialists and wanting to be on the progressive side of things, they wanted to be supportive of a lot of different issues, ranging from international solidarity issues to specific issues of women's health. We tried our best to integrate people and into those issues and to be supportive of them. And I'm not sure I can see how we could have changed anything. kind of silly about that. I thought, oh God, talk about being pompous. Nothing can change.
You're doing very well, Pat.
Oh,